Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bettina Scher. I'm from the New Zealand Treasury, and welcome today to the Treasury Guest Lecture. It's a delight tuning up in the lecture today. Let me start by introducing the speakers. Stevens is a Director for Economics and Research at the New Zealand Productivity Commission. He is an economist with plenty of experience in economic and social research. Before joining the Commission, Philip worked with the Ministry of Education, MB, and the Ministry of Economic Development. He was a research fellow at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research in London, and Philip's published in leading international journals on a range of subjects. Julian Wood is also joining us, and he is an inquiry director at the New Zealand Productivity Commission. Julian is an applied labour economist. Prior to joining the Commission, Julian was a senior researcher for an independent think tank where he focused on research into regional development, immigration, and innovation policy. So welcome, Phil and Julian. It's wonderful to have you here with us today. In this seminar, Phil and Julian will showcase the Productivity Commission's recent research into immigration and its final recommendations to the New Zealand Government on what immigration policy settings would best help Aotearoa New Zealand's long-term economic growth, productivity, and the well-being of New Zealanders. The presentation will take about 45 minutes, and then we'll have the remainder of the time, about 40 minutes, for the questions. Following the event today, we'll also be sending an email with the slides attached and a link to the Commission's full inquiry resources. As Philip and Julian present, please put your questions into the chat, and then following the presentation, we'll have an opportunity to start going through those questions. You can also vote on the questions you liked or you would also like to have asked, so that we can make sure that those with the biggest votes get asked first. Thanks. Over to you, Phil and Julian.
Thank you, Bettina. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Mormons Gamonga, ko 70 awa, ko Ngāti Ngarahi te iwi, ko Stevens te hapu, ko NZ Tuatahi te waka, ko Haerenga waka te marae. I opened that, as I have my previous lecture, just for two reasons. One is it's a proper way to introduce oneself, and secondly, just to admit a potential conflict of interest in that I am a migrant, as you can probably tell from the as well. So I am the subject of this inquiry as well. So hopefully, I think I made a material contribution to New Zealand's economic activity and well-being, but I'll let you be the judge of that. So without further ado, we'll get cracking. So the context for this presentation is the government, as is its wont, has asked us to inquire and review immigration settings for the long-term prosperity and well-being of New Zealanders. So that is to take a system-wide view, not just particular sectors or whatever, but also to focus on working age migration here. So we're not going to be talking about refugees or tourism here, important though they are. They're not the subject of the inquiry. They've also asked us to think broadly about prosperity and well-being. So think, given where we are today, virtually, if not actually, think of the Treasury's living standards framework, the kind of four capitals approach. So not just productivity, but also things like resilience, distribution, and of course the treaty impacts and implications as well. So this presentation is effectively summarising two reports that we've released recently and you can get from our website. Immigration by the Numbers, which is the first half of the presentation, which I'll be talking to, and then the inquiry report itself with its recommendations, which will be Julian. So to start at the beginning. If there's any way to turn off the admit to the lobbies, that would be very handy because they keep appearing in front of our slides. Aotearoa is a country of migrants. It's almost tautology to say so. It was the last major part of the planet to be populated, and although it's hard to be precise, historians place the arrival of the Polynesian seafarers who would become Te Tangata Māori at about 1200 in the Common Era. That's the context in which we're talking here. So the data that we have mainly starts from around the period of the treaty. By the time the Europeans started arriving in the 19th century, the population of Tangata Whenua was about 100,000. And it's often said, often by us as well, that the Te Tiriti was the first kind of policy document for migration in New Zealand. So this Maori population was soon overtaken by a rapid influx of European settlers after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiriti or Waitangi in 1840. So there was a five-fold increase in non-Maori population between 1856 and 1871. So that's from about 60,000 to 300,000. And this is a period as well when the Maori population was falling. So you can see, even in the early years, there are quite major change to the structure of New Zealand. So as we also see from the bottom, the focus of those new migrants was very much of the European and the United Kingdom. But since that period, the sources of immigrants have diversified to New Zealand, and it's been driven particularly by arrivals from Asia, for example, as a function of some of the policy changes that have happened. So most of my New Zealand's population growth in the last century and a half has come from natural increases, so births exceeding deaths. But the contribution of immigration has increased in recent years. So you can see at the end, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this green area here is basically showing that the large majority of this population growth has come from migration rather than net population. And this is a relatively new phenomena. So net migration in New Zealand has tended to be low when the economy is weak and high when it's particularly strong. So the migration was low and even negative during the Long Depression in the 1880s, the Great Depression of the 1930s, the wool shock in 1970, the oil shocks of the 70s and 80s. There was a net outflow of people from New Zealand during the economic restructuring of the 1980s, followed by an inflow of migrants until the Asian financial crisis in 1997. And however, it's not just been worldwide or New Zealand specific shocks that have impacted numbers of people to migrating into and out of New Zealand. When the Australian mining boom hit its peak, there was net emigration from New Zealand. The most recent years have seen migration soar to what are unprecedented levels. So at a time, this migration has grown at a time when international migration has grown faster than the population. Most of these migrants move to high-income countries, including, in this definition at least, New Zealand. So it's also important to note that when we're talking about net migration, we're also talking about the difference between two much larger numbers. So people flow in both directions, and immigration and emigration often cancel each other out. Indeed, the demand for migrant workers will often be a function of the outflow of New Zealand-born people. So the volume of both of these have increased a great deal since the end of World War II. Immigration started to rise first in the 1950s, whereas emigration did not start to pick up until a decade or so later. Large shifts in net migration do seem to be a function of just one or other of the two. For example, the peaks and troughs of the 1960s and 1970s appear to be driven mainly by spikes in arrivals, whereas those in the 1980s were primarily driven by departures. In the 20th century, the two appear to be more negatively correlated, with high arrivals tending to occur in times when departures were low. The surge in net migration between 2012 and 2008 was driven by a jump in the growth of arrivals, which occurred at the same time as a decline in departures. So New Zealand has higher emigration and a large diaspora relative to other OECD countries. There are a number of countries in Europe with high diasporas, Lithuania along with Estonia and Latvia, but they joined the EU in 2004 and then implemented the Schengen Agreement in 2007. So when the impediments to free movement of labour were removed, labour moved from the poorer accession countries to the wealthier members of the EU. This is a very specific kind of example. And over this kind of period, Ireland itself experienced a large decline in its traditionally large diaspora as emigration declined, and returning Maori nationals represented the largest group of immigrants. So New Zealand is not the only country with an interesting immigration story. But generally speaking, New Zealand looks more like Poland and Latvia than it does like Australia or the US. New Zealand immigrants are drawn to English-speaking and richer countries as a whole. In particular, migration of New Zealand to Australia began to pick as New Zealand's economic performance outpaced New Zealand's from the 1970s. Net migration flows between New Zealand and Australia are dominated by departures from New Zealand to Australia. The reverse flow has remained relatively static for decades. Migration from Australia is primarily the remigration of New Zealand citizens. Although New Zealand immigrants are generally highly educated, those who go to Australia are relatively less so. And one's tempted to quote Muldoon here on the average IQ of the two countries, but I won't. New Zealand-born living in Australia are actually slightly less likely to have degree-level qualifications or above than those who remain in New Zealand. So, interestingly enough, as transport costs were declining over the post-war period and migration was going up, this doesn't appear to have symmetrically affected Australians and New Zealand in the same way. So, at about 5% of the workforce, temporary migrants play a significant role in the New Zealand economy, certainly when we compare ourselves to Australia and other traditional migrant destinations like, say, Canada and the US. And the stock of temporary work visas has approximately doubled between 2009 and 2020, driven by several visa types, including the essential skills, study to work, and work to residence visa. Now, it should be no surprise to see a strong positive correlation between labour shortages and net migration. The one exception was the mid-2000s in this diagram here. I'll see if I can get it right here. So this period here was possibly the only period where the two lines didn't move together. So this was a period when the net migration from New Zealand to Australia was increasing, which may have exacerbated the reported labour shortages in New Zealand that businesses were expanding, also causing subsequent increases in reporting shortages, which remained high until the economic downtime from the GFC saw them tumble. So the economy requires more migrants when it's expanding. So the period from 2000 until the COVID-19 pandemic was one of low and declining unemployment and increasing labour participation. So that blue dotted line at the top is economic inactivity. So that was declining along with unemployment over this period. And so in such a tight labour market, expansion in jobs created by the economy needed to be met from elsewhere. There's a similar story to this picture if you look at separate industries or regions. This suggests that on average, migrant labour has not displaced domestic workers, but rather has been associated with net job creation in the economy. Net international migration has been zero or negative across most New Zealand regions over recent decades, with the exception of Auckland. However, the pickup in immigration since 2012 can be seen across all regions, with areas like the Bay of Plenty in Northland moving from net out migration to net immigration. So who are the migrants? Well, the main economic contribution that migrants make to New Zealand economy is what they bring to the country's workplace. Gains arise from workers moving to where they can make the most impact, and from firms bringing in the best workers. Overseas born adults in our working age population are more likely to have a degree or postgraduate qualification than New Zealanders, and are less likely to have no qualifications at all. According to the OECD's survey of adult skills, overseas workers in New Zealand are some of the most literate in the OECD. Migrants to New Zealand from other English-speaking countries have higher average literacy scores than the native-born, and, along with migrants to Australia and Finland, among the highest literacy migrant groups across the OECD. Although migrants from non-English-speaking backgrounds score lower than the New Zealand-born on average, they also have a higher second language proficiency than the equivalent non-native speakers present in other countries. The survey finds similar results for functional numeracy and what's called problem solving in technology-rich environments. So on average, we have a high quality of migrant compared to other countries. They're also, on average, younger. So at the national level, immigration can raise output per person of the whole economy because migrants are more likely to be of working age, and they're also more likely to be net contributors to the public purse. Now, this is a quite complicated chart, but in a sense, it shows how complicated things are. So what we see on this chart here is on the horizontal axis, this talks about the migrant share of labour. So more to the right of your diagram, there's more migrant labour in the industry. And on the vertical axis is labour productivity. So the higher you go up, the more productive the firms are. There are a few industries like utilities that are actually right off the scale because they're very high capital intensive. And so we've left them off just so you can see the designing more easily. And the size of these bubbles tells you the size of the labour in there. So it tells you something about the size importance to the economy. So what you can see from this is that migrants work right across the New Zealand economy, but they're more concentrated in some places than others. There's a group of low productivity industries that have higher shares of migrants in the bottom right corner there. There's also several higher productivity industries that rely on migrant labour. Of course, the story is not as simple as a simple migrant, non-migrant break. Industries employ a wide variety of types of migrants as measured by their visa category. So recent migrants on skilled residence visas are important for the telecommunications sector and for professional, scientific and technical services, whereas most of the migrants working in horticulture and accommodation are on non-skills related, non-resident schemes such as the RSE scheme. This heterogeneity or variety is important for understanding the impact on New Zealand's economy as a whole. So as part of this work, we did some econometric analysis, and I'll only have time to cover it briefly here, but those of you attending the New Zealand Association of Economists conference can see both Hilary Devine and myself present a couple of papers on the work. But just to summarise one of the pieces of work that we did, we used linked employee microdata in New Zealand to examine the relationship between firm level productivity, wages and workforce composition. By jointly estimating production functions and firm level wage bills, we compare migrant workers with New Zealand-born workers through the lens of a derived productivity wage gap that captures a difference between the relative contributions to output and to the wage bill. Whether we look at all industries using a common production function or separately estimate results for the 5 largest sectors, we find that skilled and long-term migrants make contributions to output that exceed moderately skilled New Zealand-born workers, with higher contribution likely being due to a mix of skill differences and/or efforts, which is largely reflected in their higher wages. Conversely, migrants that are not on skilled visas are associated with a lower output and lower wages than the moderately skilled New Zealanders. This is also consistent with this skills effort narrative. The share of employment for long-term migrants has grown over the time of the analysis, which is 2005 to 2019, and we show that their relative contribution to output appears to be increasing over the same period. So not only are they becoming more important, not only are they more productive, but they're becoming even more productive relative to New Zealand, medium-skilled New Zealanders. Finally, we present some tentative evidence that high-skilled New Zealand-born workers make a stronger contribution to output when they work in firms with high migrant shares. This is suggestive of some complementarities between the two groups. So it may well be that the skills that that the migrants are bringing, say knowledge of foreign markets or new ways of doing things, are complementary with the skills that high-skilled New Zealanders have. However, this could also be a result of what we call assortative sorting. So both people are both sorting into the same kinds of firms. But it's an interesting result nonetheless. So just to finish up my section, thinking about the impact of New Zealanders on the economy, of migrants on the New Zealand economy, we've already seen that they are more highly skilled than the average New Zealander, and they are more likely to be of working age. This is going to have a positive influence on the New Zealand economy, unless it has some negative increases on more kind of fixed issues, etc. So one of the worries has been the idea that there's been some kind of capital dilution. Although we haven't done any kind of formal analysis, just looking at the general evidence is that over the last half century, immigration doesn't appear to have caused capital dilution. New Zealand is a low capital economy, and it has been a low capital economy for a long time. The increase in migrants does not appear to have made this worse. The economy appears to have been able to meet the increase in migrant labour, except in periods where there's a rapid increase. So in the last few years, where there's been very fast increase, the capital has been slower to adjust. So there's a question still to be determined whether or not this is just a slow adjustment or there's something different happening here. So another worry is this idea that they might be taking up all our houses, and so they're driving up house prices. Now, again, we don't do formal analysis of this, but the sort of evidence that you see from the sort of headline numbers suggests that there's two reasons why then they're probably not the cause of this. First, the price of housing was increasing long before net migration rose in the late 2000s. And second, when net migration plummeted after COVID and were negative, house prices actually continued going up. And it's only in the last few months that they started dropping down again. If you're interested in more kind of formal analysis of this, I point you at the Infrastructure Commission, who looked at causes of the current house shortages, and their analysis suggests that it's actually the responsiveness of the housing market to changes in population and prices that's the driver of this, not the changes themselves. And that's very interesting indeed. So that's productivity by the numbers. There's lots more numbers in the book itself, so I recommend you have a look at that. But here's quite a few for you to be thinking about. I'll now pass you over to my esteemed colleague who will tell us about the inquiry.
Thank you, Phil. So just a small congratulations. You're now about halfway through the formal presentation side of this. So if you were champing at the bit to ask your questions, we're nearly there. Quick introduction to myself. As already indicated, my name's Julian. I sort of the inquiry director, want to acknowledge the history of this inquiry and the role of many people in the inquiry. We had Nick Green that saw the inquiry through to the draft report stage, and then Judy, who was also involved in quite a lot of the legwork involved in getting this to the final stage, and then also just acknowledge the role of the commissioners and how they played in sort of the final report that we have. So it's not me that has done the work here, it's a team effort across the commission, including the ENR research team. Broadly speaking, I'll split my presentation into two halves. There will be a sort of a broad overview of our findings and how they relate to policy, and then we'll move into the recommendation stage of things. Just to reiterate, we are concerned with the longer term impacts here. So we're not, this is not a response to COVID. This is not a critique of the response to COVID. What this is long-term immigration that's fit for New Zealand's future. So we have a sort of a time frame of the 10 to 30 years. When we look at what was produced, we do have the two shiny reports. We do also have a range of supporting work underneath that, and Philip has referenced a couple of those already. There's the Fabling et al. Research, which actually Philip was heavily involved in. There's the Divine study, which is forthcoming, and we are anticipating that that will drop soon. Look on our website for that. There's also, if you're interested in the aged care sector, we do have the case study that was, desktop case study that was undertaken. There's quite a lot of interesting information there, some of the nitty gritty around the aged care sector. And similarly, there's the construction case study as well, which I'd just like to highlight. If you're interested in Te Tiriti, there's our Whai legal document, which is an absolute wealth or goldmine of information that can be drawn on as well. So there is a range of information on our website, and I would encourage you to go there if you're at all interested. Probably the big takeaway of all of Philip's talk and where the Commission arrived at is that in aggregate, immigration has a small positive effect on productivity wages in New Zealand. So a little bit of myth busting there potentially. It's consistent with overseas studies, somewhat unsurprisingly. There's also a bit of a GDP growth narrative that we've inherited, and that is one where New Zealand has relied on adding more people to the labour force to generate growth. And this has meant that New Zealand is characterised by both New Zealanders and migrants working longer hours compared to many within the OECD. As a Productivity Commission, our report is unabashedly focused, I think that's a word, unabashedly.
It is now.
It is now. It's focused on productivity, and we do want to note that productivity is a long game. This is not something that you can dip your fingers in and expect to get gains. It does require sort of sustained investments in a whole range of physical and community infrastructure over time. We are in this for the long haul. And there's a very complicated relationship between productivity and immigration. There's one of the things that the inquiry did sort of bash its head against for a while is just the balance of trade-offs. There's a whole range of trade-offs that exist in this space, both, and you need to consider both sort of your long-run and short-run trade-offs. The other thing, and probably this is one of the big takeaways, I've been around the traps long enough to have seen a whole range of narratives when it comes to migration. There's a whole range of narratives in the current context as well. Some people blame migrants for everything and want to build walls. Other people see migrants as the solution to everything, and there's trillion-dollar bills on the sidewalk. And where we've arrived as a commission when it comes to productivity is that migration is neither the solution to our productivity problems, and nor is it the cause of our productivity problems. So that's quite a strong statement that if you are looking for migration to be your policy saviour, you're probably looking in the wrong place. And if you think it's the cause of all of our problems, you're also probably looking in the wrong place. So with that in mind, we will keep moving forward. As Philip discussed around job creation or net job creation and net migration, we do see these two things going hand in hand over time. So migrants do make an important contribution to our economy. There's a whole lot of fears at the moment. There's a lot of public debate around all of the New Zealanders leaving. Will it be 20,000 people? Will it be 40,000 people? Will we see this mass exodus of 100,000 people? A lot of doom merchants around at the moment, a lot of economists speaking into this space. What we do know from history is that migration more than offsets the loss of skilled New Zealanders overseas, as Philip spoke to. On average, migrants are more highly skilled the resident population, and they're younger. It's also, I think, fair to say that New Zealand has reduced the risks of labour shortages across the economy, notable, especially in the current debate, the aged care sector, hospitality, but also in dairy and IT. One really interesting graph that you'll see in Immigration by the Numbers actually is the regional and industry dimensions of this. I think they're important components, that it's not just a sort of at a national level. We do see this across the board, across our regions and across industries, and there's various ways of viewing that within IBTN, which I'd encourage you to go to. Another sort of myth-busty kind of aspect of our inquiry was that we actually went looking we tried to find evidence of displacement. We really did look for this because there was quite a strong narrative that migrants were displacing local workers. And where we arrived at was that on average that migration makes small positive effects on wages and employment for New Zealand-born workers. That is not to say that there are no displacement effects. There are localised time and place-based negative impacts, and these can be concentrated on the most vulnerable, and the costs can be very high for these individuals. What we also saw when you look across time is that migration also opened up opportunities for these same pockets of the population. And so is it a double-edged sword? Is that the right metaphor? There's a risk here that if you say we need to protect migrants and we need to slow down migration or remove migration from the equation, what you actually do is also undermine the opportunities going forward that migration brings. And that led us to conclude that, yes, we need to be very focused on displacement. The policy lever to pull, however, is not a restriction of migration necessarily. You need to be very active in this space, though, because the costs can be very high on people, and the appropriate levers there are around education, training, and empowering people through active labour market programs and policies, so that if there is an opportunity to be grasped through migration, that the people most likely affected are able to grab those opportunities. And I think that's an important takeaway. What we did see over time is that the system has become increasingly unbalanced. So, and I think if you look at this graph on the right here, what you do see is this massive move towards temporary migration. And what's interesting through this period is temporary migration feeds into our residence program in many ways, but we didn't see any shift in this residence line at all, what is largely flat and declining towards the end. So the government, successive governments stimulated economic growth through a whole range of new visa opportunities and categories and the promotion of temporary visas, but there was no sort of how does this fit alongside that resident stream and what does it mean? And what this did lead to, I think, was a lot of expectations around pathways to residency that weren't necessarily being met. There were, it actually sits alongside a New Zealand narrative as well, which Philip spoke to, was during this latter period, especially, we saw a slowdown of New Zealanders moving overseas. So what we saw was these combined factors of this rapid increase in migration, a slowing down of New Zealanders leading to what we have called sort of pressure on absorptive capacity. Now, absorptive capacity is a bit of a slippery fish, and we use this word very carefully. A lot of the public debate is around, when you mention absorptive capacity, it's seen as a way of speaking about migrants in a bad way. So we want to define this term very carefully. And while we acknowledge in the short run that there are trade-offs with absorptive capacity that the government needs to look at, and it can risk congestion and pressures on, an unbalanced system with investment. In the long run, absorptive capacity is not a fixed concept. So, in the short run, migrants do arrive and they create demand-side pressures that dominate their supply side. Over time, migration and migrants themselves become, net contributors to the economy overall. You see these tensions for example, in the construction industry, that came through clearly in a lot of our case study analysis, that to restrict migration because of absorptive capacity might mean that your foundation workers for buildings aren't let in, and therefore you're actually restricting absorptive capacity through that policy. So it's a very fine balance that we're running here, focusing on absorptive capacity, but it is important. And it's probably one of the first big takeaways is that as a country, we need to consider absorptive capacity, and we need to be thinking about how we manage infrastructure pressures. And a lot of that is not actually, the root cause is not migration. The root cause is somewhere else in the system. And this is the Infrastructure Commission's work, which is incredibly valuable in this space, does point to a whole lot of domestic issues with our infrastructure building over time. And where we see this heading is the need to not only keep an eye on absorptive capacity, but to explicitly include it in your investment strategies going forward. I feel like these slides, how I'm missing slides, 27 and the next one is 30. Is there any way to get to slide 28?
Yes.
They appear to be hidden. Yes. Sorry, but it's jumping around on me a bit there, and can we I'm not quite sure.
We can riff on something.
We can riff on something else. Yes. Well, why don't I keep speaking while we're doing that? Yes.
I've just taken back control of the slides and put slide 28 up. Do you want to maybe just take control again and see if that works for you?
Yes, we'll try that. Cool. Sorry about this, everybody. This is
Flashback.
yeah, short-term memory is getting a boost. Oh,
Nope.
Nope. Excellent. Let me see if I can can we see that now? Has that come up for everybody? Hopefully it has.
Yes, there's a thumb there.
Excellent.
That's what works, thumb.
Yes. I was missing a few slides earlier on as well, which threw me a little bit actually. Anyway, let's keep going. Slide 28, we're fine-tuning the current system. So where all of this has led to is this is our first sort of, in the short term, if we wanted to make some changes, where would we head? The Productivity Commission does have we have a whole range of recommendations, and the first cut I'm going to give today is looking at fine-tuning the current system. So probably the big takeaway here is that we, as a commission, argue that we need to reduce the use of skill shortage lists for immigration purposes, and we want to see wages reflect scarcity more. So at the current system, there's an awful lot of lobbying to get your specific industry on a skill shortage list, and once you're on that list, it's difficult to come off that list. There's not a lot of data-driven testing of those lists. They're often built around lobbying. So we do see the need for wages to reflect scarcity a bit more in the New Zealand situation. We're doing this largely arguing this on an allocative efficiency, that it's more important for people to be in their most or be able to make their most valuable contribution. So we do also see a need to review the visa categories and the residency point system, prioritising high-skilled migration. So this is part of the slide earlier where you saw temporary migration shooting up and you saw no response in that residence scheme. Partly that reflected the fact that the skilled residency point system wasn't reacting to this pressure that the temporary system was putting in, and we do think that there needs to be a way of using that point system in a more efficient way. Part of the allocative efficiency story, but also hinting at exploitation, is that we are encouraging the government to cease tying migrants to a single employer. There has been a move through the accredited employer work visa scheme towards this, and we're encouraged by that. There is also just a need there, I think, to be a little bit cautious. Mobility was, you were able to move under the previous system, but the transaction costs and the time lags that those were taking were quite a burden, and that was partly what we heard through our submission process. And so there is a need just to keep a little bit of pressure on this accredited employer work visa scheme to ensure that those transaction costs of moving are low and that they work for both employers and employees. Probably a big part of our recommendation is also around the way that we manage the rate and composition of low-skilled migrants on temporary visas. So we've seen a pivot under the current sort of COVID response on temporary visas to use a wage threshold. And if you're above the wage threshold, you get access to temporary visas. And if you're below, you don't get access, or you need to become part of a green list or an exemption list. We think that there's a whole lot of heterogeneity in this in migration. We saw through Philip's work earlier with all those complex bubbles that migrants are used across a range of industries. They're also used within industries in different ways, and you see a whole lot of complementarities between low-skilled and high-skilled migration. You know, sometimes you can't build a building if your ironworks and the foundation are not there. And so we need to be very careful how we control the low end or the low skill but high value part of our labour force. And so we propose that it's probably good for the government to consider a range of tools here. One that we would like to put on the table is just to investigate the use of a levy, one where there would be a flat levy across, and employers at sort of that low wage but high value end of the market, it would enable some of that. And you would certainly see that in the aged care sector, for example. It might mean that there's less lobbying and there's less reliance on skill shortage lists that allows wage pressure then to flow through the market. The last one that I want to highlight on the short term is better support for the employment standards of all workers. We note that the Labour Inspectorate is very busy and they're also spending a lot of their resources on sort of the migration exploitation. We think that there's a need to realign the funding for the Labour Inspectorate to make it able to spread the support of employment standards across all workers. So that's our fine-tuning the current system. That's not all of our recommendations, but that's a good chunk of it. We have. Oh dear.
Click on the screen rather than
which one?
Next one along.
That one there.
That one, that's all.
Excellent. Moving to our long-term wins, and this is probably one of the slides that went missing early on. We see there to be a really long-term win here if we can start to reflect Te Tiriti in immigration settings. That it became evident very early on, as soon as we started listening to the wider public, that immigration policy and institutions are increasingly out of step with the evolution of the Crown-Māori relationship across the board. Our legal advice certainly put this in its place. It's a really difficult space. We've also heard that, you know, this has been tried in the past and it's been put into the too hard basket. It's time to try again. That's the Commission's clarion call on this. It's a partnership. It's not just about the Crown inviting Māori to the table. Māori need to invite Crown to the table as well. We do not have the mana to say how this should happen. We do propose a number of first steps, however, and we'll move into this shortly. But the use of a GPS government policy statement on immigration would certainly be a way of framing up some of those discussions or inviting Māori to the table. I also we also made reference in the paper to funding of Māori participation or iwi participation inside the Welcoming Communities pilot program. So there's a number of steps that the Crown could immediately take, but this is a big, it's a long-term win. If we can get this right, this will fundamentally shift or be a step change in migration policy in New Zealand. The second step change we think that needs to happen is around the use of labour market information and monitoring. At the moment, New Zealand is a bit behind the 8 ball when it comes to vacancy indicators and skill shortage lists. So what we do see, and we saw this time again inside the skill shortage lists that exist. We see firms lobbying their way onto a skill shortage list, and then there's no way to check or verify, or there's no data empirical test for how that list is comprised or how it goes over time. We think there's a need for wage pressure information and vacancy information, and we've got a practical step that could be taken within the BOSS, which is called Business Operations Survey. Yes. So there's also, I think, a need for a better understanding of skills and skill needs in New Zealand. We note that ANSCO is quite outdated, and there is a shift, I think, a move afoot to move towards ONET. We also think there would be great value in adding citizenship data to and long-term resident information into the integrated data infrastructure. Is that right? IDI? Yeah. I know the acronyms so well. The last long-term win is this move towards an immigration government policy statement. So it's hard to explain how practical this could be, but there is a very large practical element towards this. At the heart of this is the need to reflect Te Tiriti and immigration policy. It's also about clarity and transparency. So how do we actually clarify our immigration policy settings? How do they become something that sits alongside all of the other government objectives and becomes coherent with those objectives? How do we build those connections across government objectives? It also enables us to balance some of the long-term and short-term goals. So, and this is a key element. We explain, or we would expect that this government policy statement would include how a government wants to balance those priorities and how its current settings feed into both long-term and short-term migration expectations and forecasts. So this all clarifies the situation for the public and says, here's our settings and here's what we think it will do in terms of labour supply for New Zealand. And it then clarifies how you want to invest in your infrastructure around that. So we'll go back to that concept of absorptive capacity. If we want New Zealand to be heading in this direction, and that requires us to have a growing population, to enable that growth, we need to invest in infrastructure around that. Social infrastructure, community infrastructure, education and training institutions. So it says if this is where you want to be, this is what the implications are for investment around that. Different governments, of course, will have a different balance between the short term and the long term and where they see that growth heading. But what it clarifies for the public is if this is where we want to go, this is what it means for investment. And if you're not prepared to invest in that stuff, then there's obviously now a conflict between your immigration policy and the rest of your government policies. So we do see this as having a practical application in the real world. It's a 5 to 10 year statement of where you want to head. We do, however, think it could be linked through to budget rounds for education and training and those funding. So there is a practical element to it. And that's probably our headline takeaway. If we could create a step change in the economy going forward, it would probably be the ability of this immigration government policy statement. And that is where I say thank you very much. When you do get to see a copy of our slides, you'll see a few slides we're missing, and that's fine. I've used up my time anyway.
I wonder whether you just want to say a couple of words on the links between the education system and the migration system, because I think that was...
Yeah, that was one of the slides. Maybe I'll flick back there. So actually, I won't say goodbye. I'll keep talking.
Sorry, Bettina.
Yes, it is kind of a key component, and it fits in here. And this is the other aspect that we looked into. So we looked into... Can you hear us, Bettina?
We've got another 5 minutes, so if there are some slides that you missed, you'll go back up.
Excellent. Cool. Well, we'll jump in on this one here, because we've looked at wages, we've looked at productivity, we looked at employment. The other kind of key labour market dimension to this is training. And this does speak to, if we look at the last bullet point there, we'll just jump straight into the crunchy policy issue. When it comes to migration, there were no links or feedback loops that we could see between occupations on skill shortage lists or even education and training priorities and how they linked to migration flows. There's a big disconnect in our view between the migration system and our education and training system. Now, that's at a policy level. Above that, we do have the incentives that migration creates. And this is a space where migration does actually impact on the real world because, free access to migration certainly impacts on firms' decisions around making or buying of skills. I use those terms very carefully. And it's also impacting on the government's decision to make or buy or to train or spend on training and education. There's certainly a very strong business case for some industries who are high growth. You think of some of the IT sector and things like that. There's such a lag between training and what you're needing right now through skill shortages that there is a case that can be made for migration. So we're not saying that migration's bad at all. But there needs to be coherent links between migration policy and our skills in education and training. And so that then loops back to our GPS, for example, if I skip back to the GPS. We need to remove these silos of information, and they're expressed through the difference in our short-term responses here and potentially some of our long-term responses. And a lot of that does come down to, how does migration fit alongside education and training and investments in absorptive capacity? And that's where I'll leave us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip and Julian, for your really interesting and comprehensive presentation. It was really great to see all that data and also the sort of more specific policy recommendations that have emerged out of it. And I also look forward to seeing some of the ongoing research that you are about to publish. Now, we don't have many questions yet in the chat, so I'm keen to get some rolling if people are keen and have got some really tricky questions for Julian and Philip. Great. Oh, and Ganesh has joined us too.
Kia ora.
Kia ora, Ganesh. Nana, who is the chair of the Productivity Commission. So thank you for joining us too, Ganesh. Right. Okay. We're gonna have questions till around 12:55, and I am happy to. Right. We've got one from Tim Hughes. Hi, Tim. Did you have a look at wellbeing outcomes for migrants that went beyond incomes and wages and the role of settings like family visa policy in supporting these?
So I'll kick off on this, and we want this to be a conversation across Philip and Ganesh. So it's likely that I will start answering and then someone else might jump in and correct me. Or we did look at, and this is a little bit of a tricky policy area, where our primary focus was on working age population, and it becomes immediately obvious to anyone when you look at this that if you're talking about retention rates, those family and wider visas have an impact. So we did look at this, but we looked at it through that primary secondary lens. And so we did look at family visas, but mainly through the retention rates. And unfortunately, we didn't come up with any recommendations in this space. And that would probably be an area which
not specific recommendations, but we did encourage, obviously, the finding around retentions and migrants who were committed and wanted to stay. And the longer they stay, the better the outcomes.
Yeah.
And so there was a couple of recommendations to encourage that sense of commitment from migrants, and also the importance of the welcoming migrants communities,
yes,
welcoming communities programs, to encourage that settlement.
Yeah, also there was recommendations that spoke to the speed of processing and the need to sort of encourage the system to work as efficiently as possible. Certainly the global competition for talent is heating up, and this is one area where New Zealand probably needs to rethink its visa processing, and to ensure some clarity around those expectations for residency, but also just not leave people waiting in a line for too long.
And I think that's reinforced by, I think we said it in the forward. Well, I said it in the forward about, and I'm conscious in terms of the presentations and the body of the report does look at immigration from the perspective of workers, and that was the focus, but just cautionary tale about migrants are not workers, they are people, and the people have habits of coming with families and communities, and that's that I suppose is the dimension that is quite important if we're in terms of making step change in terms of the outcomes, not just for the migrants but for New Zealand communities as well.
And whilst a country is not a company, it is useful to think about it as like an employer, and if you want to attract the best people, you're conscious that it's not just the salary, as it were, that attracts. It's that life that they're allowed to live.
Yeah.
And when you're a country that's a long way away from everywhere else, those family ties, and I do speak from personal experience, those family ties are actually even more important. And you kind of so actually when they've come here and they've built up skills and knowledge about how to work in New Zealand, etc., you don't want to lose them just at that point where they're becoming super productive.
I'm going to take Chair's privilege and ask for a short follow-up question to that one. Did you look at the impact on environmental outcomes at all in terms of that aspect of wellbeing?
Within the supplementary papers, it is discussed. So that would be one where we would go back to the supplementary paper. We really need Jeff Lewis in the room right now because this was his area. I mean, do we have a strong?
Well, I mean, it's in a sense, population is population.
Yeah,
in this sort of sense, I don't know whether migrants are more or less impactful on the environment than New Zealanders, but one has to be conscious of that in the same way as you'd be thinking in your GPS, for example. You'd be thinking about, it's a statement of how we think the system should look and fit together, and if that includes environmental concerns in there as well. I think that's how it would mainly fit in there.
I would probably, and without wanting to, I suppose, sit on the fence, I would take environment as part of our absorptive capacity, and so it's the population growth or the population size and composition that impacts on absorptive capacities, not necessarily migrants. So in that context, a GPS on immigration should at least acknowledge concerns if there were on absorptive capacity in terms of that environmental dimension, and indeed climate obligations would be one of the other areas of government that needs to be connected to decisions around immigration and infrastructure investment and education and training. It's just encouraging how we can bring them all together.
Thank you. I'll move on to another question from Margaret Galt. Did you do any analysis on whether the closed borders changed the behaviours of firms around either the make versus buy decision, i.e. any sign of a higher level of internal training, and the labour versus capital choices, i.e. any signs of firms investing in labour-saving technology?
Should I start with that one, or should I?
I think that's
so one of the pieces of work that we mentioned earlier was a piece looking at the RSE scheme, looking at the responses of firms, and this is a very from a researcher's perspective, is a very interesting case because there were some firms who had already received their seasonal people, and we could predict, and they could predict how many people were needed, etc. There, so the response there appears to have been basically to bring in basically replace international labour with domestic labour. So which suggests that there are at least other people around. Of course, this is at a time during COVID where economic activity generally was dropping, so there wasn't so many jobs in tourism, so that's what maybe we would have created that, but it certainly shows it's capable. I believe that the kind of case study analysis and the contributions that we've received from the sectors have argued that they were not necessarily, they weren't as well trained or as productive as other workers. I don't think we have at the time. There hasn't been enough time for the data to tell us about some of the things like the capital adjustment. I mean, that's literally just coming out now. Those capital adjustments. Certainly, there's a famous case in the US where Mexican workers were reduced into the fruit sector, and there was a kind of capital labour replacement. And I think in the frontier firms inquiry, a previous inquiry that looked at the horticulture sector. You know, that there has been some developments in that capital investment whereby, you know, fruit picking, etc., is now more happening like that. But things like training, I think, takes quite a while to come online. So it will be an interesting. Although I would say again, at the time, we're talking about a time when firms were taking quite a big hit in sales. So those investment decisions, you know, they may have been doing those investment decisions at a time when they didn't have much money to be doing it with. But that said, they have their labour. If the labour were already in place and they needed to do something with them, they may well have spent that time upskilling. So we didn't look at it yet because the data hasn't come out yet. But that's a really interesting question. Yeah.
I mean, across the case studies, you did see sort of wage responses to labour supply shortages, which was, you know, heartening. But yeah, whether that will exist over the long term and what the response will be with the opening of the borders, we can't speak.
And as economists, you do expect that if someone thinks something as a relatively short-term shock, they're more likely to just wear it. But there are occasions when people get kicked into sort of new states because of these things.
Cool. We have another question. This is a good one. From Susan Wilson. What is the Productivity Commission's view of the government's recently announced immigration rebalance, and do you think it goes far enough? What's good? What needs improvement? Who would like to take that one?
Yeah, well, we've been asked this before, unsurprisingly. Again, to recognise the difference that we've got, the immigration rebalance we would argue, was very much focused on how do we get out of the COVID situation with the borders closed, and then what happens when the borders open. So we would see that in the different light to our inquiry, which is very much about long-term settings. I suppose the two specifics that we are concerned about in terms of the latest rebalance, one is around there doesn't appear to be any connection between the temporary visa category inflow and the permanent residence planning range. And so there's still that disconnect that we're waiting for, and hopefully there will be some announcements soon about that. But that is a concern that, again, those two things seem to be being handled and approached separately rather than in a connected frame. The other one, that, as was signalled in our inquiry, the use of the wage threshold as a very blunt tool to filter out or make decisions about temporary migrants, that we're not convinced that that's the best tool, and we'd be keen to explore keen for the government to explore other options around, as Julian pointed out, around a levy. But more broadly, I think the rebalance is a start. We would see it as a start, but we definitely don't see it as that step change to a high productivity immigration fit for the future situation that we have in our inquiry in terms of our recommendations and our report. And we'll be keen to see and await quite I wouldn't say anxiously, but quite welcomingly, the formal government's response to our recommendations, which we hope will be coming through in the next couple of months with a bit of luck. Obviously, there's a new minister that's just taken on board, so that may or may not delay that a bit, but hopefully not by too much.
Do you sort of support the general idea, I guess, without necessarily it being part of the rebalance, but the general idea that temporary migration should be more skill focused? It was one thing reading your report, it didn't come through entirely clearly.
We think, well, the temporary migrants, or indeed permanent migrants, they should be decided on in terms of their contribution to productivity and well-being. Whether that's high skill or low skill, that's a moot point, because, as Julian alluded to, there are many migrants and indeed New Zealand workers who are arguably low skilled according to the classifications, but are of high value in terms of delivering well-being. And the prime example is workers in the aged care sector. So that's where we we need to put that lens on in terms of productivity and well-being, rather than immediately assume that low skill is not delivering us the well-being that we want.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to this in a sort of a practical level, maybe through some of the dairy industry case study. It appears that under the ANSCO classifications, you're either a 1 or a 4, which means you're either at the bottom of the skill classification, you're at the top. And if you're a farm manager, you're at the top. And if you're anything else, you're at the bottom. But it sort of becomes clear that actually those migrants at the bottom, they have a range of skills that aren't being captured within our current skill classification system. So
Excellent.
part of that speaks to that and needing to improve how we're mapping and understanding skills. So it's quite dangerous, I think, to just speak of high skilled and low skilled migration, and then just equate that to that blunt wage tool. I think we have to be very careful in that space.
And you might think about this in kind of three separate parts of the economy. So there's parts of the economy that require temporary workers because they are cyclical. Yeah, trees grow at a certain rate, fruit tends to come around about once a year. So there's this kind of clear cycle to it. So the alternatives are to use temporary migrants to fill those humps, or to have New Zealanders filling those humps. But the question would be is what happens to them when they're not doing that. So if those humps fall neatly with, say, the school holidays or whatever, then that might be a way of dealing with it. Otherwise, there's going to be some people, that might, be a difficult thing to manage. The second one is truly temporary shocks, as it were. So a shortage of labour just for the moment, and we're going to deal with it in the longer term. But we need to get some people in to cover while we're moving, while we're moving out, and that can happen in fast-growing sectors, for example. And you might, and particularly in sectors where you can't necessarily replace labour with capital. So these kind of fast IT type jobs or knowledge economy jobs, you can't put a machine there. You need some people in there. The company's growing, and if you think about companies growing, that may be in response to, say, a big order. So a growing new firm gets a big order abroad. It just needs to produce some stuff. That's a very much a temporary situation as they grow, and hopefully they can grow the workforce. And then finally, there's those people that could be replaced for labour. There's a choice about the technology they use in there, and that's a different kind of situation. So I think your policy. So again, the fruit pickers who could be potentially replaced by machines, for example, or not. That's the technology demands. So those are three very different situations. I think that again, it's that nuance that's really important to understand what you think's going on, and therefore have your policy response to that. Because if you try and fix one policy and do that to everybody, you may end up having some quite adverse consequences coming out of it.
Yeah.
Kia ora. I'll take the next question from Marco Garlick. How can the immigration, and it's not totally unrelated to the last conversation, how can the immigration system better manage the highs and lows caused by seasonality, especially in the tourism and horticulture industry? Or should it even try to do that?
I think that's where we, again, let's not try and solve every problem with immigration, and let's make sure we have, as on the slide, what are our objectives for immigration? How does it connect with our long-term objectives across other government agencies and objectives and goals? How does it connect with education and training, and indeed the aspiration to move to a highly productive, high-wage economy? All of those things go together. Whether it's immigration for seasonality, you manage that through a very transparent GPS system, which says very clearly to firms and businesses and communities, these are the levels or quantities of migrants we're going to bring over a period of time, whether they be these categories or these categories. And then business and communities can plan on that basis, rather than the perverse incentives that we've got in the current system, which is to encourage that lobbying behaviour, encourage that behaviour, which is very much that quick short-term fix that we're all after.
And I think that's where I'd come back to our comments around allowing wage pressure to reflect scarcity in some respects. That I think there's a risk here of these green lists and the firm lobbying that can create inefficiencies over time. So we do want, if there are sectors that have seasonality, we do want there to be wage pressure in those sectors as well, and that can encourage sort of labour mobility across sectors. So and we need to be very careful of excluding the market from these solutions.
Thanks. I'll move on to the next question from Talaksha. How can we go about measuring what our absorptive capacity is? I think this, comes to the point that Ganesh has made several times, that we need to be more connected and interconnected in immigration policy. And this is one of those places we might do that. So I think this is quite a challenging question.
Absolutely, and we wouldn't see one single indicator of absorptive capacity. I don't think it's a one-dimension thing. And so, for example, in terms of physical infrastructure, I would think that the Infrastructure Commission would have a big role to play in that, in the context of how well their infrastructure is able to cope with various scenarios of population growth. Similarly, in terms of provision of health services and education services and those sorts of things, again, those agencies should already, one would argue, have a fairly good indication of how well their capacity within those systems are to absorb or to grapple with various scenarios for population growth. Similarly, community ability to welcome migrants or new population into their areas. So I think it's a range of those sorts of indicators rather than one single indicator. And again, it's just encouraging those different arms of government to be connected. And obviously one of the ones that out in terms of physical, obviously housing, undoubtedly. And we've already got various indicators out there. It's bringing them together into that context, I think.
And that might be the importance of one of the importances of the GPS, because in a sense it enables that coordination. It creates a reason for that coordination. Because again, if responsibility for various aspects of it are separated around, then it may well be that they're not going to be integrated in the same way, or etc. So just as you might think of, I don't know, if you want to build a house somewhere and the wastewater's being laid there, but there's no electricity going there, you've got a problem. You need a way to think about how those are integrated. So this allows that to happen over the longer term when those investments are made. If we want this is what our plan and what we feel should be happening. Here's our scenario, and as you say, the scenario. So sectors like the health sector and the education sector, they're driven. The margins and the changes are often driven by a migration, because that can happen very quickly. So I know from experience that the forecasting in the education sector, for example, it's very easy to work out from births to starting school, because people tend to get older at about the same rate every year, and so you can see them kind of coming in. But of course, migrants going to appear out of nowhere and suddenly start building. So at the moment, what we do is we kind of respond to regional councils' views of what they think is kind of going on, and that could. What usually happens there is when you add them all up, they all add up to much more than the total is going to be, and so having a GPS gives the reason for these people to come together and kind of go, well, what does that mean for you? What do you think here? What's that implication? So you've got that unified view, which I think is really important.
It would be an iterative process too going forward. So, as you adjusted some of your settings, you'd say this is what we think it's doing for forecast, but then you're obviously reflecting on that and reviewing that over time. So
sure.
I think there would also be that you can imagine it like some of our other settings, which have kind of a range of population growth that we're comfortable with over time, and it's when you sort of systematically are outside of that over time, that's when you start reflecting on, well, are we investing in the right places here? Do we need to invest more in our education or healthcare or other institutions? Or is it time to start adjusting those temporary settings with a view to bringing it?
So I'm also conscious, so you asked about measures, so we kind of avoided some of those.
I guess one in terms of those measures, how do you know that you're hitting the constraints? How do you know that you're up against limits to population growth? Because normally we look at prices, for example, as economists, and sort of infer things. Actually, it's quite hard to know when too much is, when you've hit the sort of limits to growth on population.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this is, and maybe I'll twist this in an odd direction, and people will blame me later. Through the case studies, for example, you could see it when you listened to people who were delivering services on the ground. And there were little hints through the case studies like, we've had this massive influx in school children that need English second language training. And that's actually quite costly, and that means we're lobbying for more funding. So that's a little signal, it's a little bell that you should be listening to. And you won't find that pressure everywhere. So, for example, also in the case studies, Time and time again, we heard of farmers saying, what's all this palaver about absorptive capacity? We don't have any absorptive capacity issues on our farm in Southland. We've got houses for everybody. If anybody wants to come and live here, there's a house, you know. So there is I think a real world grounded element to this as well, where you are having to listen across different sectors and different places and different regions, which means it's complicated. There is no,
and I think the thing that I would caution about, yes, we have to measure, but let's not forget this is meant to be over the long term. So we're not responding to every single. So it's not a measure that we're going to measure every month or even every quarter and then respond immediately.
Yes.
It's those long-term track that we're after.
So I think that's where that recent work by Infocom is really interesting, because what they've done is they've not just looked at prices, as you say, prices but that could be all sorts of things that are going on. It could be migrants, or it could just be the fact that there's land banking or something else going on, you know, RMA or something. What we know as economists is that prices in relatively well-functioning markets cause resources to be allocated really efficiently. So what you can do is you can actually look at that. So how well is a particular market? How efficiently is it working? So what the Infocom work has done is said, when there are changes in prices or changing in major variables like population, in these two periods that they looked at, in the earlier period, the housing stock responded relatively quickly, so had a high elasticity in economic terms. Whereas in more recent years, that hasn't changed. So that tells you something about how well the market's functioning, because that says, well, the market doesn't seem to be able to deal with this. So there's something else going on which we need to think about before. That's something that's, you know, it may well be that there's other sectors where you can do that kind of analysis to look at the, you know, that how well are we responding, which is different than just how many houses have we got. Because again, markets adjust really subtly. You know, average house sizes, depending who needs home, what time, you know, does everybody have their own, you know, houses? Do we have in smaller houses? You know, all those kind of things. You know, markets adjust at all sorts of margins.
I'm just going to just skip one question, and I'll go back to Gabriella's question in a minute. But this sort of builds on the theme we've already been underway. To what it's from Tim Hughes. To what extent is a government policy statement on migration implicitly a population policy? And on what basis would a government set an optimal growth rate and target level of population over the medium and long term?
I was waiting for that one. I wouldn't call it a population. I wouldn't. I'm definitely steering well clear of optimal population growth perspective. We haven't done their work on it, and that's a big piece of work if we were going to go down that track. But undoubtedly, within the immigration policy settings, there's got to be some formulation of expected population growth, and that's what's in one. And in terms of the wording of our recommendation for a GPS is how does our investments align to our expected population growth? Now, different governments will land differently on what their expected population growth would be. I think the purpose of it. Government policy statement is to make those expectations transparent, so then businesses and communities and governments can respond accordingly, and indeed government can respond if actuals turn out or look like turning out significantly different from those expectations. That's when we can, as Julian indicated, that's when we can think about levers, whether it be levers on migration to influence population growth, or whether it be levers on investment to ensure that the absorptive capacity is going to cope. So that's where I'd be in terms of the link between immigration, the government policy statement and population. There's implicit in all of our decisions some expectations about population growth. We just see the GPS as a mechanism to make those expectations more transparent, and that's going to help everybody who have to make these decisions. Because at the moment, where all of those decisions, I think, are, without being too critical, do seem to be in a vacuum in terms of expectations about population growth, or implicit. And I'm one of the economists that like things to be explicit. So when we make a mistake, at least we know why.
Yeah.
Or when our expectations are unfulfilled, we know why.
Your recommendations on that front in terms of transparency and more interconnectedness as a result of that. Now I'm going to go back to a question by Gabrielle Nguyen, and it relates to wellbeing issues in terms of migration. Is there any work done in the space of mental health being and overall well-being of migrants in New Zealand?
There's a migrant survey.
Yep, there's a couple of there's a couple of research papers directly looking at migrant health, but they're quite specific and sort of time-based and location-based, but not a systematic. I don't think a systematic examination of that. Yeah,
and it's not something that we did explicitly.
No,
at all.
no.
But as we say, the migrant surveys that are out there do indicate. Do have very good findings in the context of migrant outcomes are relatively positive. The migrants who stay in New Zealand on average, and yes, on average holds a lot, but on average, very good outcomes.
There's also migrants, some sample selection bias potentially, and
absolutely,
people that are not settling well tend to leave for whatever reason. Yeah, so
great. One last question I think we'll have on the panel's thoughts as to pros and cons of immigration as a partial solution to our ageing population longer term.
Ooh.
And you looked at quite a lot of the evidence around that.
Yeah. I have an opinion, but go.
Well, I think you just need to look at the population pyramids, and one could argue that migration has always been used as a mechanism to balance out New Zealand's population pyramid, definitely over the last 20, 30 years. Whether I'd say it was a solution to our ageing population, I'm not sure. I'd also say I'm a little bit averse to framing the ageing population as a problem that needs to be solved, because I don't actually think it's a problem. This is an ageing population, but that's part of the global challenges we've got. Going back centuries, has been the longer life, and whether it's be through medical health, through medical advances and all of those things. So we're moving to, and we're transitioning, and we'll continue to transition to the reality that we are all living longer. I think the economists or the economic model that we've got is not very good at catching up that. We still got an economic model that's based on the idea that we start work at 15 and finish work at 65, and haven't got there. So I think the challenge is about our economic model rather than to plug the gaps around the so-called problem of an ageing population.
Well, it's a cultural model, maybe more than an economic model. It's a perception of what life should be. But I guess one thing I would caution is that, in a sense, what it may do, that the danger would be, is if we used it as a way of not facing up to that discussion about what should a working life look like in a world where, a generation or two ago, people retired at 65 and they may not have made it another many more years.
Absolutely.
So society has clearly changed, and then at some point there needs to be a major thinking about that. And the idea that being past retirement age and working is just because you run out of money. Well, actually, it can be a quite fulfilling thing to be doing. Some of us quite enjoy our jobs. So I think it's really important that we don't use that as a get out of jail card, because that conversation has to be had. And whether you take the Japanese route of building robots or whatever, we have to think about what does society value, and what place does migration play in that. That's a big conversation. That's more than just this inquiry.
Love to have it though.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Julian, did you have some thoughts about that?
I was going to mention Japan. And I certainly think there are a range of responses here. I think solution or solve, those sorts of words are very dangerous in this context, and I think there is a wider discussion that I think that, as Philip alluded to, that needs to take place. Sort of come back to our finding around productivity, that it's neither the cause nor the solution to our productivity problem. I think you would find a similar situation when it came to ageing population. Certainly it isn't the cause, and I don't think it would ever be the solution, or shouldn't be seen as the entirety of our solution. Yeah.
To be clear, it has on average made our population younger.
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
And that's one of the big lessons from Japan, because they, as a nation, have not used migration as a way of
Balancing that pyramid.
that. And you certainly see how far ahead of the curve when it comes to the aging population they appear to be than a lot of other countries that have used migration. So it is part of your, certainly bringing in younger people does shift your population pyramid. So yeah.
And you can see in those societies and from a macroeconomic point of view, I guess the challenges of an aging population are becoming clearer over time. Now, we've got one more question here. Is there scope to drill down in the government policy statement to a regional level? And would you think that would be a sensible approach?
I think there'll be elements in there that would have regional perspectives and dimensions, like, for example, absorptive capacity. There'll undoubtedly be a regional dimension on that.
Yeah.
Some areas, some regions may be constrained, whereas other regions won't even be feeling any absorptive capacity constraints. So there'll be those areas. And similarly, our labour markets are regional. Undoubtedly, and so that's the point in terms of getting the good data at that regional level.
I mean, and one of the interesting changes over recent years has been the move from effectively Auckland being the sort of the place where migrants go to being more regional, and so some of the regions like Bear Plenty, Northern, etc., are actually growing in size. Of course, the difficulty is that people move. So I can't imagine a world where they come to New Zealand and then we don't let them leave. We've got police on the borders or whatever, stopping people moving around. But clearly, but that lineup with industry and region is clearly an issue. So it's hard to grow grapes on Queen Street, although the traffic's slow enough, I guess you could. But if the horticulture sector is growing, it's usually growing in areas where there's much less dense population, and as the submitters made clear to us, there's lots of houses on lots of farms that are free for labourers. So it has to play a dimension in it, but exactly how is nuanced.
Yeah, and whether that's within the GPS or whether that's in that more operational level, I think we're agnostic at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, and if you are driving towards transparency at a national level, that can impact how regions view their own growth paths.
Absolutely.
I think Philip alluded to that through the education example that he had, that when you put all these plans together, they don't sum to what they should be.
Yeah.
And that's, we see that in the sort of regional development space as well. So there's sort of a, what would you say, sort of a refining fire there maybe that says, if this is actually where we're heading, then we know that our regions underneath that kind of need to fit within that as well, and can inform their investment decisions.
Absolutely.
And where they're planning to build their community infrastructure as well.
And let's not forget that information is also useful for our businesses as well, businesses to inform their investment decisions as well.
Yeah.
Well, that's unfortunately we've run out of time, but that was really great discussion, and I like the three of you sitting there with the fireside.
Yeah.
100 people sort of at the beginning of the conversation, so that's great. So thank you, Philip, Julian, and Ganesh, for taking your time to share the results. And thank you also to all the people listening in today, and particularly those that provided really thought-provoking and great questions. Please look out for some upcoming seminars that Treasury will hold. We're going to be having a series on our wellbeing report coming up. So I think, hopefully that conversation we started today will about the wellbeing impacts of migration and population policy might form part of that as well. Coming up, we have Nancy Hay from the What Works for Wellbeing Centre in the UK, and we also have Dr. Anita Chandra, the Vice President and Director of RAND Social and Economic Wellbeing, both of which sound like they'll be really fascinating. So tune in for those. And just like to do a final thank you to everyone for attending. Piki te kaha, piki te ora, piki te wairua, Māori ora e, mā te wā.
Kia ora. Kia ora.